Epidemiologists study diseases and injuries and how they're distributed in populations, and factors that increase or decrease the risk of a person being sick or injured. That's a general definition that doesn't tell you a lot. I'm more interested in practical epidemiology, which I'll get to in a minute, but this slide is a little complicated, but it illustrates the sorts of things that epidemiologists study. Obviously, we have people who have the potential to become sick or injured. We have agents that can make them sick or injure them. And in the case of infectious diseases, those agents are such things as viruses, bacteria, and parasites. Usually those agents are conveyed to the person by some vehicle or some vector. We usually refer to animate carriers as vectors and inanimate carriers as vehicles, but that's not particularly important, these kinds of classifications. But examples, for example, cholera was conveyed to individuals through the medium of water. Food, water, and that sort of thing were major problems throughout much of human history, and have been mainly controlled in the United States and most of the industrialized countries, but are still a major problem in the less economically advanced countries. One of our major problems is injury that has been neglected substantially. And the agent in the case of injury is the various forms of energy, mainly mechanical energy. In motor vehicle crashes, gunshot wounds, the same principles apply at falls. It's all Newtonian physics, the amount of force that's involved relative to the vulnerability of the person. And of course, person characteristics make a difference as well. If you have osteoporosis, you're more likely to be severely injured with the same force compared to someone who does not have osteoporosis, as an example. So we have these intrapersonal characteristics that make us more or less vulnerable. We have interpersonal factors in this little larger circle, such as if you belong to a street gang or a drug dealer, you're at substantially increased risk of getting shot. And then there are institutional and cultural factors, the economy, the extent to which people who operate various governmental institutions are knowledgeable in the control of various diseases and injuries and so on. But this just gives you a little idea of how epidemiologists think about these things. We think about what is it that injures or makes people sick, how does it get to the person, what are the vehicles and vectors, and what are the broader characteristics of the persons and society in which we live that increase or decrease our vulnerability and exposure to these things. Practical epidemiology attempts to identify changeable factors that are necessary conditions for harm. There are a lot of non-changeable factors that are related to risk. The one that's most cogent to us is age. Falls, for example, are a major problem as we get older. But we can't change our age. So that, while it's maybe interesting, is not a changeable factor. The stairs on which we convey ourselves are what's in the environment to trip us and things like that. Those are changeable factors, and those are the things that we concentrate in practical epidemiology. This all started more formally as a formal type of investigation about the middle of the 19th century. Of course, people before that knew something about different hazards, and there are biblical references to various hazards and the fact that people should be aware of those hazards and so on. But in more modern times, about 1854 to be exact, there was a physician in London named John Snow who questioned the prevailing theory at the time of what caused various diseases like cholera. There was a theory called the miasma theory that said that decaying materials in the environment put stuff in the air that made people sick. Well, they didn't know what these things were, nor even that they were decaying objects or decaying animate entities. Snow is experiencing patients having cholera. And he questioned the miasma theory, so he did this little map of the section of London where these were occurring. And these little black entries on his map here are deaths from cholera. You know, there's one household that had a bunch of them. Another one would only have one. There'd be one here and there. But obviously they're clustered. You don't see them out here. And he says, why are these occurring here and not occurring out here? Well, right in the middle of this is a little street called Broad Street. And right in the middle of Broad Street was the pump to the well where people obtained their water in this area. So he convinced the city council to take the handle off the Broad Street pump. And all of a sudden, there was no more cholera. He didn't know about the bacilli that caused cholera. That was only discovered 20, 30, 40 years later. But he did know enough to know that this is very likely in the water supply, and if we cut off that water supply, we can control this disease. And that's what I mean by practical epidemiology. 100 years later, the Indian Health Service, which provides health services to Native Americans, mainly on reservations, was transferred from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to the Public Health Service. And in subsequent years, the disease rates plummeted. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has been a troubled agency from its beginning and is to this day over things like oil contracts, and there's a lot of corruption and that sort of thing. And this was a very fortuitous event for Native Americans because the Public Health Service were professionals, physicians, nurses, epidemiologists, environmental health specialists who knew what to do about many of the problems that were plaguing people in the Indian Health Service. And to give you an example of the differences, in 1955, when they took over the Indian Health Service, gastroenteric diseases, which are usually caused by bacteria in the intestines that result in diarrhea and dehydration and kill people, was about 5 times higher, 4 to 5 times higher among Native Americans than the all U.S. population at that time. By 1975, it was a little more than twice as high, and by 1995, almost the same. And this was mainly because of the sanitation, restaurant inspections, and the sorts of things that were instituted by the Indian Health Service, as well as improved medical care.